Hello, and thank you very much for coming along to Global Climate Change and Africa, the series. Today we're going to look at the enduring legacies of colonialism and the coming perfect storms for the continent of Africa. Enduring legacies and the coming perfect storm. The legacies ensure that the perfect storms, that is, the convergence of different climate phenomena at once and in new magnitudes, will occur in the future. That's why they're coming. These are not predictions, they're studies of trends. The multiple legacies of colonialism were both brutal and, in historical terms, very recent. A brief historical overview by Basil Davidson made this clear to the world in 1984. He visited the continent in several different countries and narrated firsthand what he was seeing there and what he knew from its history. He produced it in a film called Africa. You can see it through transition studies on the internet, written and presented by Basil Davidson. Episode 6, This Magnificent African Cake, is of particular interest. He introduces us to the continent along one of its many, many coastal regions characterized by beaches, seemingly endless stretches of beaches, which are in place because of geologic phenomena that are fairly stable, or at least have been, for the last 500 years, indeed, perhaps for the last 5,000 years or so. Here we can see there is a freshwater component to this presence on the coast. It's back, though, from the ocean. So fresh water here and a very thin bar of sand protecting it from the salty ocean. On these freshwater sides of the lagoons, you can often see ruins of old European buildings, which have fallen into disrepair in recent years, but are very important historically. And it's this which Basil Davidson traces in great detail. It's only by looking at the history of this that we can understand current-day anomalies, like the fact that there are countries, the Gambia, for example, along a river, which is totally surrounded by another country, except on the ocean side, that is, by Senegal, with its capital in Dakar. This is a seemingly artificial construct. How could it occur that this kind of structure of the nation-state was imposed upon this part of the world? Well, part of it has to do with the ways in which the Europeans carved up the African continent, quite literally, on a map which contained some of the information they were thinking about, but not much. All maps are partial, but these ones were particularly skewed because the Europeans had not penetrated much beyond the very coastline and didn't know what was to the interior. Yet they were making plans to divide it up between themselves as nation-states in Europe. Basil Davidson does a masterful job of summing up how this occurred from the conference in 1884 and 85 in Berlin. With the advantage of hindsight, then, Let's have a look at some of the colonial legacies from the recent past, since, say, about 150 years ago.
The west coast of Africa, looking today much as it did 100 years ago. At that time, the old evils of the slave trade had become a distant, though disgraceful, memory. But there now opened a new chapter of confrontation along these tropical shores. In past years, Europeans had come here for profitable business. Now they wanted more, much more. Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the Black Continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufacturers, and new positions of advantage against its rivals. This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? The helpless children, meanwhile, sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun. The European invasions were widely resisted. Conquest was never easy. And sometimes, as these old drawings and photographs testify, conquest led to a ruthless killing that later generations would prefer to forget. Resistance took many shapes. In French West Africa, a focal point was found in Muslim loyalties. Many heroes, still unforgotten, came on that scene. Some, like the Senegalese religious leader Ahmadou Bamba, offered the way of peace, but were still sent into exile. Others, like the fierce warrior leader Samori, fought off French attack after attack and was crushed and exiled only after years of war. Death took many, strong or weak. With the skulls of earlier wars displayed in their capital, Kumasi, the powerful Ashanti nation ruled over most of modern Ghana. Led by their kings, who had the title of Asantehene, they'd long defended their country against Britain. But now they desperately wanted a peaceful settlement. In 1895, fearing a disastrous war with Britain, King Prempeh made a strong bid for peace from his palace here at Kumasi. He offered the British the right to establish in Ashanti a chartered company with all the concessions, the privilege that such a company could possibly desire. But it wasn't enough, for the British now wanted territorial possession as well as privilege. The Ashanti nation had already fought long, hard battles against the British. But this time, in 1896, they decided to surrender. In a ceremony of deliberate humiliation, the king was made to kiss the British commander's boot and then sent into exile. But it wasn't the end of the story. The British now blundered. A new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, decided that he had to get possession of the sacred golden stool, symbol of the Ashanti nation's soul. Arriving at the British fort here in Kumasi, he ordered the assembled chiefs to hand the stool over. Worse still, he demanded the right to sit on it, something that no person had ever been allowed to do, not even the king himself. To Hodgson's final insult, the Ashanti replied with war. This little fort at Kumasi is what the British had built, just in case, and now they sorely needed it. The few dozen British inmates of the fort were besieged for months and had to eat rats to stay alive. Hodgson's act of folly had exacted a bitter price. Efforts to send in relief from the coast were repeatedly frustrated by Ashanti resistance, until finally the governor and his wife got away to the coast and the absurd but tragic affair could be closed. This ended war between Britain and Ashanti, and a year later, in 1901, the British quietly annexed the country, which became part of the colony of the Gold Coast. All over Africa, the new military technology of automatic guns gave easy victories to the invaders. Countless resistors died, many thousands at the single battle of Omdurman in Britain's conquest of the Sudan. Meanwhile, in another part of the Sudan, the French were also scoring victories. For the most part, public opinion rejoiced. For were these not victories over an inferior species, a kind of joke humanity? There were some critics, but not many, and their voice was ignored or silenced. What really mattered was to do down one's European rivals. If you were British, to get the better of the French in West Africa or of the Germans in East Africa. While orphans, like little Uganda, were left on the protective doorstep of Father John Bull. Even before 1900, there came a new source of conflict: settlers from Europe. French in the far north, Dutch and then British in the far south, and some Germans. Other settlers were attracted to the good farming land of the east, to Tanganyika, northern and southern Rhodesia, and the British territories of Uganda and Kenya. Once again, nobody asked permission. An early French governor had laid down the golden rule. Wherever good water and fertile land are found, he said, settlers must be installed without questioning whose land it may be. The settlers, not surprisingly, agreed. The next step in East Africa was to build a railway from the coast to the interior. The line was completed in 1901, and millions of acres of good farming land in Kenya were opened to white ownership and settlement for the buying price of next to nothing. These white strangers, oddly enough, were at first welcomed by the African inhabitants. But the welcome didn't last for long, for they soon discovered that colonial government wanted them to give things, above all their land and their labor. These colonial demands provoked a repeated resistance. And against that resistance, the colonial government, with white settlers arriving in ever larger numbers from Britain, waged a war with little mercy, and of course, with rifles and machine guns, against spears and arrows.
Macinire nĩ ũndũ wa kũmena andũ ũndũ gũtikĩrĩ ũndũ mekagwo nĩ kũmakia andũ ũguo magagĩũka magagĩtorekia nao andũ mora-rĩ magacina mĩciĩ. This beating down of a sometimes violent and desperate African protest was called pacification, or less politely, hammering. A British officer then fighting in Kenya kept a sadly instructive diary.
Marched into Fort Hall, and the expedition comes to an end. To my mind, the people of the Embu have not been sufficiently hammered, and I should like to go back at once and have another go at them. During the first phase of our expedition against the Irieni, we killed 797 niggers, and during the second phase against the Embu, we killed about 250.
There was, in fact, much more of the same thing. In a sixth campaign against the Kenya Nandi, for example, British troops reported killing 1,117 people, besides seizing all their livestock. In 1906, a junior British minister in London cabled this protest: "Surely it cannot be necessary to go on killing these defenseless people on such an enormous scale." The minister's name was Winston Churchill, but on that occasion his intervention had no effect.
Well, this is where Basil Davidson left the narrative in 1984. A very powerful statement, in especially episode 6, this magnificent African cake. It illustrates very well what some of the legacies of colonialism might well have been, because it underscores the traumatic nature of colonial expansion and domination In 1984, 82 years after Joseph Conrad, he basically reiterates the simple point that Joseph Conrad made in The Heart of Darkness, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Even Winston Churchill concluded this in 1906, but his words had no effect on mediating the suffering of those in the colonial circumstance. Well, we can look at the enduring legacies of colonialism, and there are many, but we also want to relate it, especially in the current moment, to the coming perfect storms. That is, Africa is going to be experiencing a changed climate very dramatically, in part because of policies put in place during the colonial period. And we want to look at the connection between those two things. What does the colonial legacy in each of the African colonies have to do with the global climate changes that we are now all experiencing? Well, we're not experiencing them all equally, and that's one of the problems. But let's look more carefully at the policies. In fact, the policies and development schemes introduced by various European powers during the colonial and post-colonial periods have had an enormous impact on Africa and are likely to continue to victimize the continent for centuries to come as the global climate changes drastically. Further, the heightened tragedy is that the continent that has contributed the least to global pollution from the industrial combustion of carbon will be among the hardest hit by climate change. This is a point that is made again and again by Kumi Naidoo in this interview very dramatically with Deutsche Welle recently, and the need for the rest of the world to catch up to the promises it's made to Africa over the climate mitigation strategies. Moreover, we cannot claim that we were not warned about this. Scientists and social scientists have been warning the world's leaders and the public for decades. Decades since the public testimony made it apparent. These now sound like prophetic and enduring Senate testimony, but in fact, they were well known at the time among the scientific community. Consider, for example, the 1988 testimony of Dr. James Hansen before the Senate in June. This historic testimony has recently been emphasized this past week in the United States in a national frontline documentary entitled The Power of Big Oil. Denial. It's part one of a three-part series, and you can see the whole series one week after another. This last week was part one, next week will be part two, and the following week will be part three. Joined by other prominent climate scientists on a panel before the Senate, the scientific evidence of the greenhouse effect was documented publicly by James Hansen in 1988. The testimony made front-page news in the New York Times the following day. After all, we get from the New York Times all the news that's fit to print, and this was apparently fit to print as the lead story on Friday, June 24th, just before the weekend. Global warming has begun, expert tells Senate. Sharp cut in burning of fossil fuels is urged to battle shift in climate. 1988. Well, what happened? What happened was the denial, this key component here, as part one of this documentary underscores. Those involved in the fossil fuel industry began to deny the scientific evidence that up until then they had agreed to. How did this happen? Well, it happened because two billionaire brothers made it happen, Charles and David Koch. Through their firm called Koch Industries, started a massive campaign to counteract the scientific evidence. But it wasn't only Jim Hansen versus the Koch brothers. Others had foreseen the dilemmas and the difficulties we faced then and ever since as a human community, well before Jim Hansen's statement to the U.S. Senate. In 1981, for example, James Gustav Speth, known to his friends as Gus Speth, stated a crystal clear assessment of the struggles that modern civilization would have to face. He didn't do this here in the United States. He was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, and he did this in a documentary put together by the BBC entitled Warming Warning, compiled in 1981. More recently, he's helped publish a book entitled They Knew, the U.S. federal government's 50-year role in causing the climate crisis. Let's have a listen to what he said in 1981.
It's possible that we could have very, very serious changes in global climate, in precipitation patterns, in wind patterns, and effects on agriculture, and effects on societies. It's hard for me to imagine a more serious environmental issue. We ought to face the fact that we can't use all that coal. When we make decisions about developing synthetic fuels, when we make projections about long-term energy needs, and which technologies to use, the CO2 issue is simply not seriously considered, and it's high time that it should be. Do we have a right to play around with global systems in that way? I mean, is the world ours to play with, to experiment with? I think not. I mean, I think we owe future generations, other life on the planet, a profound duty of restraint. And right now, we don't seem to be exercising it. I don't simply mean that it's the worst environmental problem that we've ever had. It is certainly one of the most serious environmental problems that we could ever have, I think. But it's also a dilemma in the sense of how to respond. The scope of the response, the number of people that have to be involved in a response if it's going to be effective, the pressures pushing against a response. In that sense, it poses us with both a dilemma in terms of the seriousness of the problem and the possibilities of solution. I think it's going to be terribly difficult.
In fact, within 3 months of Dr. Hansen's 1988 testimony, evidence on the social impact of altered climates was presented in a further Senate hearing. Social scientists and historians joined the natural scientists, and ever since they've been warning the world's leaders and the public for decades. Some of this testimony was made public to the larger reading public. Beyond those who read transcripts from Senate testimony, there was a book published on the basis of that Senate testimony in 1992 that contained an annotated bibliography because the senators asked for more information after the testimony. They and their staffers had not heard about the collapse of previous civilizations due to radical shifts in their ecosystems. So they wanted information, and this book provided it. It emphasized pattern, trend, and prospect. Threefold development of the argument. The historical aspects of environmental decline in the policy and the area of policy in the past, the trends that were underway, and in fact, the trends that were underway, particularly in Africa. Chapter 3 is devoted to the Third World in general, but Chapter 4 looks specifically at the environmental decline in post-war, that's post-World War II, Africa, as a case study. The back cover summarized the summary of the testimony fairly succinctly. Public policy decisions we make today will largely determine the environment that we and our children will inhabit in the decades and centuries to come. Ill-conceived or misdirected public policy can aggravate long-term environmental decline and provoke large-scale ecological disaster. There's nothing new in this. The archaeology of ancient cultures serves as a sober reminder that mistaken public policy has, in the past, had a costly and enduring impact on entire civilizations. In our own day, third world regions are experiencing the most rapid and dramatic cases of ecological decline. Patterns of resource extraction and agricultural change, engendered during the periods of colonial rule and sustained by international trade in subsequent decades, have left these regions with depleted assets, vulnerable economies, and rapidly deteriorating ecosystems. On a global scale, population growth, accelerated urbanization, and the increasing petro-intensification of world food production have created a powerful, vicious circle that is driving industrial civilization, like many urban cultures in the past, toward a syndrome of overshoot and collapse. This testimony, published eventually for the public in 1992, was based on earlier work done on the ecology of imperialism, undertaken the year before the Senate testimony, published in 1987. It drew upon the basic dynamic of our selected biological species, well known to biologists on every continent. Our selected species are those with a constant rate of growth, a constant positive rate of growth, not a negative rate, but a positive rate of growth, inevitably expand to a carrying capacity and then overshoot that carrying capacity. When they do, they collapse. Overshoot and collapse syndrome is frequent in the natural world, and as it turns out, far more frequent than was previously recognized in human history itself. Human populations expand beyond a declining resource base, overshoot that, and then collapse. An alternative is possible, namely in recognizing a declining resource base, populations can take public policy and private decisions to reduce their expansion to below the continuing carrying capacity, even if it's reduced. But this is very rarely taken as a solution in human history. Overshoot and collapse is the drumbeat of human history, just as the procession and recession of ice sheets is the drumbeat of the last 1.5 million years of glacial history in the geologic record. A drumbeat, not an exception, a recurring pattern. This is what the ecological lessons of the past and the anthropology of environmental decline can teach us. All civilizations depend ultimately on the ecological viability of their agricultural base, as the environmental archaeology of ancient civilizations makes clear. Expansionist Western industrial culture, dependent on resource-depleting petroleum-based agriculture, is only different in terms of its global scale. If the lessons of the past are not heeded, its collapse will also be global. This is why social scientists and historians have warned over the decades that one of the biggest problems is for the Western industrialized societies to overcome the multiple legacies of European colonialism. Legacies are not those alone in the Third World or in Africa. They're legacies of thought, behavior, and habits of proceeding in the Western world itself. The question is, can the West survive its own most cherished historical myths? This has been examined in a several-part series, and in the second part, we've looked at the enduring myths that dominate the Western world after 500 years of European colonialism. The myth of racial or cultural or religious exceptionalism. That's to say, everyone else is different, but we're exceptions to the patterns of global history. This is a prominent and, in fact, pervasive theory at the base of Western racism. Then there's the frontier myth, an ensuing illusion of the economies of perpetual growth. For a while, frontiers made sense as European maritime empires expanded on new territory around the world. It seemed like that territory would be available for expansion forever. But in fact, it was a myth, like the myth of racial exceptionalism. Finally, the myth of techno-scientific salvationism grew out of that effort and, in fact, experience of expansion on the world, because Europeans in particular thought it was their scientific genius that enabled them to dominate other peoples and other forms of energy. They were, in effect, moving from wood to coal, from coal to petroleum, from petroleum to natural gas. And they thought that there would always be another step, perhaps to nuclear, perhaps to fusion. The illusion was that there would infinitely be available a techno-scientific solution to the problems of constraint experienced from the limits of frontiers. Well, that's not so, and it's social scientists and historians who have been warning the world's leaders and the public about this for decades. It's most dramatically apparent in the sociology of the American phenomena of sprawl. A recent study looked at the end of suburbia, oil depletion, and the collapse of the American dream in these terms. Let's have a look.
It's a happy-go-spending world, reflected in the windows of the suburban shopping centers where they go to buy. The shopping centers see these young adults as people whose homes are always in need of expansion. People who buy in large quantities and truck it away in their cars. It's a big market. These young adults, shopping with the same determination that led them to the suburbs in the first place, are the goingest part of a nation on wheels, living by the automobile. The first young adults in the age of the push button.
Americans, by and large, love suburbia. It has promised space, affordability, convenience, family life, and upward mobility. After half a century of constant development, more than half our population has moved here. And as the population of suburban sprawl has exploded, so too the suburban way of life has become embedded in the American consciousness. Suburbia and all it promises has become the American dream. But as we enter the 21st century, serious questions are emerging about the sustainability of this way of life. Does the suburban dream have a future?
The whole suburban project, I think, can be summarized pretty succinctly as the greatest misallocation of resources in the history of the world. America took all of its post-war wealth and invested it in a living arrangement that has no future.
The basic cause of it all is the end of cheap and abundant energy.
Cheap oil is the party that we've been enjoying for the past 150 years. And that party is coming to an end.
So, the social scientists and historians have been warning that this era is coming to an abrupt end. This is why the chapter on the prospect at the end of the book in 1992 was of particular interest. The title of the chapter was inscribed as Time's Arrow and the Human Prospect. As a historian, the author pointed out that it's true, history never repeats itself, but citing Mark Twain, he emphasized another more important point. History does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. That's the case with the overshoot and collapse syndrome. It rhymes with other overshoot and collapse syndromes well known in the archaeological record of ancient civilizations. Well, in considering global climate change in Africa, we're going to be looking at some of these things. In the coming studies, we expect to examine specific chapters in Africa's ongoing struggles with a changing global climate. In the process, we expect to highlight the particular colonial legacies that have shaped the policy options available in Africa today, and then examine specific case studies of the perfect storms that are likely to affect the continent in the foreseeable future. This is not predicting the future. It's looking at the pattern, the trend, and the prospect. Now, world scientists, as we've pointed out, and historians have been pointing this out for quite some time. And 15 years after the initial public publication of that Senate testimony, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change drew the world's attention to the most urgent regions of the world that are going to experience horrific transformations in the very near future. In the 2007 synthesis report, emphasis was placed particularly on the Mekong Delta and the life support systems that are fed by the Mekong River, and its vulnerability in particular to sea level rise. The same case was made for the vulnerability of the Bangladeshi plain at the confluence of several rivers that empty into the Indian Ocean. And in Africa, the emphasis was placed on the vulnerability of the alluvial plain around Alexandria. In fact, the stories since then have corroborated the statements made in 2007. Egyptian city of Alexandria is sinking due to global warming, according to one report. Alexandria expected to sink by 2100 AD, surrounded by a sea from three sides. So, despite the 15 years between the initial warnings and the 2007 report, we can ask what's happened between 2007 and 15 years on top of that, right to today. Well, the reports are continuing to come in if you look at climate change in Egypt. And you have to ask yourself, what have we learned? What have we done? Well, the fact is that 30 years after the initial reports presented to the Senate and 15 years since the IPCC gave its dire warnings about sea level rise and estuaries, very much more has been learned, but very little more has been done. We'll be looking at this in greater detail, especially in reference to Egypt's vital dependence on the Nile and the rising sea of the Mediterranean. What about the other end of the continent? Cecil Rhodes, famous colonialist, became famous in part because of his Cape to Cairo dreams, fashioning a whole continent with new technology in a way that would accelerate the extraction of resources and build a certain kind of economic prosperity, especially for those who dominated major corporations. But what's been happening down in southern Africa at the other end of the Cape to Cairo dream? Well, very recently, in fact, all in 2022, this year, Storm Anna has dumped torrential rain over that whole part of the continent. Further, it's affected people in Malawi and Madagascar and Mozambique, a rare tropical cyclone. 45 are dead in reports from April 13th. And as this one put it, madness happens in Africa, exclamation point. Terrible floods in Mozambique and Malawi from tropical cyclone Anna. The obvious tragedy is one of infrastructure as bridges are torn away by torrential rain and raging floods. But the long-term tragedy here is visible in the color of that water. It's taking with it the topsoil, which is absolutely crucial for the future growth of plants and therefore the food supply of the region. It's not just in South Africa, but up in Burundi, rising floodwater uproots families as well. And of course, across in Madagascar, homes have been swept away. And 45,000 people are in need of humanitarian aid from UNICEF. In fact, back in Mozambique on the mainland, the havoc that has been wreaked is staggering. Severe flooding in Mozambique has created an inland ocean. Well, the inland ocean makes it not only difficult to get around, it makes it impossible to plant crops. When this is drained, most of the topsoil leaves with it to the ocean. But even that which remains behind is in muddy and soggy fields that can't be planted for months necessary during the planting season. As a result, Mozambique faces a food emergency, and cholera is mounting, as one would expect as people congregate in refugee villages and have a limited fresh water supply. Waterborne diseases become rampant. The series of headlines are now grouped together. 1.6 million face hunger in Mozambique following deadly cyclones. Plus, second report, record-shattering heat wave scorches Europe. Plus, a study has indicated that the current pace of climate change is unparalleled in 2,000 years. These were all from 2019, 3 years ago, but the process has continued right through April of this year. 340 dead in South Africa. In fact, death toll in South Africa's deadliest floods on record tops 300. And this happened just last week, April 14th, 2022. Further in the future, we will explore new impacts on Africa's own future imposed from outside the continent because of how it's become embedded in the world economy. Nigeria has become important in European consciousness again because it's facing gas shortages, having imposed gas rationing in reference to its source in Russia. This has given rise to hopes for more gas exports to Europe from Nigeria. This time, a mega gas project envisions going right up over the Sahara. It's a staggering new development, but one in which Nigeria is being asked to extend the life of fatal fossil fuel economies, at the same time that it's suffering from the impact of the use of those fossil fuels. This is why time's arrow in the human prospect is important to keep in mind. Overshoot and collapse is a syndrome which is indicated. History does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. We're going to work on the global climate change in Africa as a series, looking at the enduring legacies of colonialism and the coming perfect storms, which will be part of the story. Storms which are likely to get more frequent and more severe, hitting particularly the coastal regions, but also the interior. Extreme weather will be the expression of climate change in Africa. Keep in touch. Stay in touch. By scanning these QR codes, you can reach our essays and the latest news about climate change and Africa.